In pretty much all of our audits, I always use some data analysis as part of our preliminary analytical review and part of our preliminary risk assessment process. And we try to pick some classes of data to review. And one of the first things we always look at is the audit trails, user permissions, payments, receipts, payroll, journal entries. So we get the data files for those and do some analysis on them, which will show up in the following slides. So the key components of that is to obtain the data, import it, and then validate it. And the validation is really key to that, because more often than not, I usually get data that has a wrong date. For example, I'll get a date, I only wanted the 2014 year and it's got all the 2013s in it. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the right stuff right from the start. And part of the review process that we use is to look at the field statistics that are generated through IDEA, and I compare those to prior years, to my expectations. We've usually done some reading of the board minutes, talked to some management people about what's going on. In our area, everything's pretty local, so we read the papers and know people that work in the district, so we've kind of got some ideas of what might be going on, and we can look at that through the data files to be sure that they're supporting what we're seeing. This is an example of a comparison of two different payments date data fields, and it compares the 2013 data to the 2014. We're in the process of actually doing the interim part of our school district external audits, where we look at the internal controls and do a lot of our risk assessment works. Our schools end have June year ends, so we try to get in May and early June to get a good handle on what's going on before the year's over, so that when we come back in August, we have already done the risk assessment. We can have developed much of our audit plan ahead of time. So this is what we're doing with this now. And so one of the things we get to do is I look at those payment date fields for the payment files, and I'm looking for how things are working. Like, for example, you can see that the number of records in both files is pretty consistent, so that's kind of given me some ideas that this year's got about the same number of payments going through it. I look at the earliest dates, and right off the bat on the 2013 looks pretty good. That's July 5th, 2012, so that would be right for that year. But this year has a earliest date of May 12th, 2011. So either two things: something's really wrong with the data because the number of records is relatively consistent. But what it turns out to be when I clicked into it is that there was a void check that was dated originally dated in 2011 and actually voided out in the current year. And we can see the most common date is a Thursday, which is probably around the date that they usually have a standard time to run checks is on Thursdays, so that's okay, that makes sense. And you go down through the months and see that they're pretty much in line with the way they were the prior year, so there's no big changes or unexpected things there, except you'll notice that there are 8 items in June, which is stand out, but you want to check into that because the last date was May. So what are all these June checks? Are kind of strange. There shouldn't have been any June checks, and those two are all voided checks that were written in June 2013. So right off the bat, from looking at the payments, the date field statistics, looking into it, you can get a pretty good idea of things that are going on. No payments on Sundays. I also like to look at the numeric field statistics. And this particular example is it's actually a BOCES and not a school district, which very similar in operation, but a little bit different. The same basic principles will apply to it, but I was able to get permission to use this information because the client is very supportive of our work in these areas. So looking at there, we can just kind of compare and see that the values are relatively close in line. Kind of, if we were looking at the budget, we would say, yeah, it went up a little bit. This does make some sense. The records consistent again. Averages are fairly close, relatively in line with each other. So is the standard deviations. I'm still trying to work out some ways to use some of the other statistics of variances and skewedness and stuff in our testing, but that's a work in progress. That data was overall data, all the payments made by the BOCES or the district, and then I like to fine-tune that. So I'm just looking at the operational funds. So I usually don't want the trust and agency funds in there. I don't want the extra classroom because I look at them separately. I'm just really looking for the main funds, which would be the general fund, the special revenue funds, cafeteria, and maybe the capital projects, although that one too I might look at separately because it's got very large payments which might skew things. In this particular case, there is no cafeteria, there's only a general and a special revenue fund. And once again, when you do the fine-tuning, which you usually do through an extraction of some sort, either an indexed extraction where you can identify the individual funds or direct one. You may also have to correct for any date errors when doing the fine-tuning. If they gave you the data for 2 years and you just wanted one, you would have to extract out just the year you wanted. So once again, you also want to check the field statistics and revalidate the data, make sure the dates are correct, and all that kind of stuff. After I do that, I like to get an idea of the relative sizes of the population and what's going on. For a long time, we had the old audit step was to review the ledger for large and unusual transactions. My unusual transaction, I could tell what it was by looking at it, but I had a hard time figuring out a way to come up with a consistent way of defining large. And I was listening to a webinar a couple months back on transactional scoring, and they said that a large item statistically is generally one that's more than 2 standard deviations away from the mean. So a light bulb went off and I said, okay, I can start to use that as a way to define what I'm going to look at for being large. So I set up a stratification, and I use the mean as depending on where it falls, the mean generally is going to be the first part of my strata, and I use the increment as the standard deviation. So you can see that this was stratified by that, using that standard deviation amount. So if I want to look at the large ones, I have 23 that are over the upper limit and 3 that are more than in strata 4. I can click down and drill into them and see exactly what they are so that I can decide if they're unusual or not. Generally speaking, in most schools, the large items may or may not be unusual. They're going to be like maybe bus purchases, debt payments, things of that nature. Although in one of my nonprofit clients, I was able to identify an unusual transaction where the executive director deposited monies for another organization in their accounts, and I was able to pick up on that very quickly by looking at the stratification. And it's also kind of interesting to note that less than 1% of the total records makes up 65% of the total amount. After I've done that look for the large items, I usually do what I call an incremental stratification, which basically, some people call it a histogram, use a histogram, and they use different types of bands for it. but I've gone through and kind of defined different layers that make sense to me, that I want to see what kind of what size payments are running through those through the organization. Are there a lot of really tiny payments that maybe they need to do something about them, like combine their payments somehow, or do order differently so they're not always making all these small payments, which can be fairly expensive to process. I also like to use this as part of our sampling plan. One of the things we're really trying to do is target on risky areas, and if I've got a whole lot of really tiny payments that don't amount to a hill of beans, they're immaterial in total, I don't really want to I want to make sure my sampling might not pick up on a lot of those. I want to pick up where the risks are. And I can also click in and drill down into each one of those strata to see what's making up those different types of payments. What's going on? It kind of puts everything in a little bin that I can look at and kind of get a better idea. Part of our approach here has been we want to do a better job than traditional sampling will let us do. So we're trying to combine using of data analytics to augment our traditional testing, or in some cases, if we can do it better using analytics, eliminate it. And that we'll see a little bit later. Another pretty standard test that I run is the Benford analysis. I haven't really found any issues using Benfords, but generally it's based on the theory that digits should have a specific pattern to them, and that generally digit 1011 should have a much higher frequency than 99 or 98. You can see the pattern is the curved lines, where the spikes indicate things that are not in conformity with Benfords. And that's pretty typical in schools where you see some spikes. These spikes are from this district pays Medicare payments to its retirees, so it pays out a whole bunch of payments to these retirees, which kick in the spikes. They're all for roughly the same amount and start with the same digits. They also pay out a lot of mileage for sports refs, and also sports refs too, which tend to be abnormal for the analysis, but they're not abnormal in terms of the school itself, or an indication that there's been any kind of internal control issue or fraud or anything else. They're just knowing the data, knowing the process kind of says, yeah, you expect to see them. I've used that in the nonprofit world to look at donation files, and you would expect to see donations of 10, 50, 500, 1,000, and if you see the spikes there, you know that confirmed what I expected there. This is an example of some payroll testing. Depending on the nature of the software, you can get these. They enter the earnings for the individual types of earnings in the system. So if somebody had a paycheck and part of it was a regular contractual payment, part of it was some kind of extra duty, part of it was coaching, part of it was who knows what, that would all show up separately in the payment file. So we can go through and do a summary by the earnings type. And I've had some with as few as very few. This is 12 different earning types to as many as 130 or so. The better ones usually average around 20 or 30 of them. But what that helps you do is to look at that and say, well, we know they have really good controls around their contract payments. They're the same every week. The supervisors know them. They have a good rollover when they're setting up the contract amounts. We maybe don't need to concentrate our testing in that area. So we look at this and we say, what kind of payments would be the most risky, and what's their materiality level? Are they really important or no? In some cases, you may have, if you saw a vacation being a really large material number, you might pick a few of those to test. The same with some of the other types, the hourly, which is the H, the daily, have they done based on a timesheet or something like that. So when I'm doing a payroll test, rather than just do a plain random straight out test, I'll say, well, I'm going to take a couple of the contracts to check them through, but I also want to make sure that I've hit on the what I consider to be the more risky type payments. There was one situation with I saw vacation pay, and there was quite a bit of it, and it turned out that it was principals getting paid vacation pay that wasn't in their contract. So that can help you turn up by looking at drilling down into this data, you get a much better feel for what the payments actually are than if you just took a straight sample. And this is just an example of how I picked the different, how I set the sample size, tolerable rate of 9% in this case, and 90% confidence level. You would adapt that depending on the situation and what your tolerances that you expected. And then this is a printout of the actual history that shows the number of records that were selected to do in the to make in the sample. One of the things we're trying to do with the risk assessment part is kind of combine our control testing so that we're looking at how more than one way of looking at things and more than one way of testing things, so that maybe our sample size is either reduced or more effective by using the data analytics. This is an example of an analysis of employee pays using statistics. And what I use it for is to help identify large unusual payments to employees. So if somebody got a strange bonus or something like that, you might identify it here by looking at that max amount, comparing it to the average amount. Generally speaking, somebody that's on a contract and gets paid the same amount every week is going to have a zero standard deviation. So somebody with a large standard deviation may be an indication that that's something wrong there, or something to look at anyway. And like at the row at the bottom, there's an $8,900 large payment. There could be a number of reasons for that. There could be a stipend to coaches pay, some kind of twice a year thing that throws it off. But that'll help you go down and look at employees, and you can set up parameters and say we just want to look at just show in the report maxes that are greater than 5,000, or whatever is appropriate for your situation. So that kind of helps you sort things out and look at things in a more manageable way. Our key focus this year in developing our audit approach has been to try to look at internal controls and do a better job of testing them, to kind of, where possible, replace or lower the amount of traditional sampling that we might do, because we can test 100% or much larger coverage using analytics. In the old days, we're going to use we used purchasing as our test here, and the purchasing agent's approval as a key control. We would have gone in and we would have said we're going to take a sample of, I don't know, 50 or whatever purchases, and we're going to see that the purchasing agent signed the PO. Well, with data analytics, we can now go in and we can be comfortable that the purchasing agent actually did approve all the POs, and then we can go in and identify items that don't have POs, so that we can say, well, gee, should these items have had POs or shouldn't they? So now, rather than doing a very limited thing and trying to use that to prove that something existed, we're going and looking for what didn't happen that should have. So some things to consider when you're deciding on testing controls using data analytics is just as in any other type of test, is it a key control worth bothering with? Is it worth spending the time to develop a test for? Do you have the appropriate data? Can you get the data files to support the test and actually run the test? And even if you have that, does the computer system itself have appropriate and built-in safeguards to ensure that you've got reliable data and that your test actually means anything? If it doesn't, if these systems that we're working with are pretty locked down, if approvals aren't done and aren't in place, the purchase is never going to move up to the purchasing agent to approve. If the purchasing agent doesn't approve it, it's not going to go out into a PO and then be placed off to a vendor. So you have to know the system well enough to say, yeah, this is what's going to happen, and these conditions will work. And then, will using data analysis be as effective or more effective than traditional sampling methodologies? And then you have to look at yourself and say, do you have the skills necessary to design that test using the idea? And if you have that, do you have adequate time, money, client cooperation available to do it? It does take a fair amount of time to really to design one of these tests, but once you do it, you'll be able to replicate it successfully over and over again with some fine-tuning and tweaking. So we're going to go through and we're going to look at purchasing and the purchasing agent's approval in particular. When I was designing the test, I had to ask what could go wrong with the purchasing agent's approval. What could happen that could give me some false information, or that the purchasing agent really wasn't doing the approval. And what do I expect my results to look like? I expected to see in a well-designed system where the purchasing was functioning properly that there would be relatively few payments that should have POs that don't have POs. I also expected that there should be a relatively long time period between when the PO was issued and when the check was done, so that if things are functioning properly, the department head would be approving requisitions, passing it on to the purchasing agent. The purchasing agent would have time to review and approve the purchase, make sure it was done properly, that the bidding requirements were done, any other legal requirements were done properly, so that and then the purchase would be issued and an invoice received back. So I shouldn't expect to see a very, very short time period between a PO and an actual check. Lastly, in the system itself, only the purchasing agent should be able to approve and issue a PO, and the purchasing agent should be competent. So we did a multi-pronged approach to testing those above criteria. Okay, so as an overview for our test, the first thing we wanted to consider was, is the purchasing agent competent? Do they know what they're doing? So I usually sit down, talk to them, have them tell me about some of their bidding regulations, how they do it, what's going on in the purchasing system, just get a good idea that they know what they're doing, that they know what's going on, what kind of experience they have in the purchasing, how long they've been doing it, get an idea to see, do they really care about what they're doing, or are they just rubber stamping? Next thing we look at is the system controls, the access, permissions, the design safeguards, making sure that only that purchasing agent can approve purchases. If the first two aren't in place, you might not as well bother to do all the data analysis, because it really doesn't mean that much. And by the same token, a traditional sampling, if you're looking and seeing and saying, okay, the purchasing agent signed this PO, and especially if it's a computer-generated and signed PO, if it doesn't have those computer controls in place, that's probably not a valid test either. And if they're not competent, then you haven't proved a lot either. And the last part of it is once you're satisfied that the first two exist is to go on and do the data analysis. As part of every audit, I always try to look at the system controls and get a good idea what's going on. And we asked about the usernames and passwords in particular, make sure they're unique to each user, that they're not shared accounts, so that you can make sure of who's doing what. Do they use strong passwords? Do they change the passwords on a regular basis so you know that only the right people are doing what they're doing? I like to get an audit trail. Audit trails can vary with different systems, and some are a lot better than others. We have one that does a very, very detailed job. It includes every user activity from logging in to logging out, to all the systems functions, to who's making and changing permissions, as well as all the keystrokes that people are making. So some are very, very detailed. Others are much less detailed, and they only provide actual user activities, what they've approved, and really core user activities. So when I get the audit trail, I find it really helpful to summarize it by various types so that I can get an idea. I can summarize it by, you'd have to look at it and say, what actions or categories, what modules, payables, purchasing, general ledger, accounts receivable, payroll, all those things. Summarize it by activity and then by user so you can see who's getting into what areas, and you're looking at that to see, are there any internal control violations, people in areas where they shouldn't be. But for the purpose of this test, we summarized and see who is doing various approval levels in purchasing. And that's going to follow along in a second. So we designed that test to make sure that only the purchasing agent is actually signing the POs or initiating them through the system. In some areas, in New York, we have a state law that says their school district can only have one purchasing agent. So we've actually found using that there were schools that had more than one purchasing agent. So we had, things to write up in our management letter for that. Also found an instance looking at that audit trail where one district had a retired person who was changing people's permissions in the system. Well, the retired person really wasn't doing it. It was the district's treasurer who was making and changing the permissions using that other person's account. And of course that was a pretty severe internal control issue because you had the treasurer who now had access to do whatever they wanted in the system. So by doing that summary of the audit trail, you can learn quite a bit. This is a snapshot of the purchasing approvals, and you can see it's kind of important to know what all the different approval levels mean. In this case, the higher up approvals are the basic entry levels, but the key is the very bottom one, which is highlighted, which is issued PO. And there was only one person who did that. So we know that only the purchasing agent actually was issuing POs. So that was part of phase one of our data analysis test. You have to make sure you've got the right data to do your analysis with and that it's reliable. In New York, we're lucky, and maybe you guys have it in Texas, is our state comptroller office has designed preset formats and data downloads to be for the various vendors to use, which they provide to them, and they also provide the same data files to us. In actually one instance, there is an off-site company that manages the client's data, and they send it to us directly so the client can't even have access to the data files that we're provided with. And once you get that data, you use the same techniques that were discussed earlier to validate, get to be familiar with them, review it to be sure you've got the right data fields. And when you're designing that test, you need to really be familiar with it to know what kind of data is going to be in there that might lead to false designs. So, for instance, you might have some false negatives, which would be the PO, the payments that should not have POs showing up as missing POs, like debt payments, the retiree payments, sports reps. So you need to know their system well, and you need to know what kinds of payments are subject to PO. And that's stuff you would talk to the purchasing agent about when you're doing the your interview with them. And you'd also use some common sense to make sure what they're telling you makes sense in that area. And after you know those, you would have to design your idea test with equations to minimize those issues. And down on this next slide, I've got some examples of some of the things that I did to minimize some of those issues. I identified various types of objects in the accounting code that would not have PO, that should not have POs. For instance, those Medicare payments, sports ref things, payroll type things, certain fund type transactions, like those would be the T funds, the trust and agency, payroll transfers, any health insurance payments, things like that. They don't usually use POs for here, so I tried to eliminate all those and then came up with a formula for how to test whether there should have been a PO but wasn't. And this is actually the initial test results from my tree and idea that there were only 29 payments in the general fund that shouldn't have a PO. There's none for the CS cafeteria. There were no cafeteria funds, so there would be none of those. And then the special revenue fund had 3, which, looking at it, that's a pretty good result from 2,300 payments. But when we look at the actual details of the payments, you could say I probably have a little bit more work to do in my design elimination, because there were a number for unemployment insurance and taxes and things like that that would not have a PO. And the people's names or stipends, once again, something not usually a PO. They're for workshops, and they're fairly small. So, but I reviewed this with the purchasing agent, and those were pretty, we were able to determine that they were in pretty good shape with that. I have used it on other districts where we found a number of payments that should have had POs and didn't. We reviewed it with the purchasing agent, and he looked at it and said, well, I don't know why we didn't. We'll change the policy and start working on that. In one instance, I had a district where the cafeteria wasn't using any purchasing agents. I had told them about it in a previous audit report, and he thought they were using it, and they weren't. And there was also a specific department, I think it was the buildings and grounds, that wasn't using POs the way it should have been. So this particular test, you can not only design it by fund, but you can have it also so that it reports out to you on a department basis as well. The next part of what we talked about with a successful test would be making sure that there was an adequate amount of time between the date the PO was issued and the check date. Our files don't have invoice dates available, or I would incorporate that as well. But what I did was I joined the PO report to the payments file, and then I used @age to calculate the timing between the two dates, and then I did a stratification to see how the different rates fell. and then you can click, I could click down into it and review that with the purchasing agent to see why different payments were at, faster than I would have expected. And for here, for the most part, there's 42 that are not. Probably many of them are travel. And I know that the claims auditor is working on trying to get the departments to do a better job of doing things faster and not being in a rush. So this kind of test would help to support them in those efforts. The last step is to look at the results of the test and drop a conclusion for it and write it down. What I found useful for that is I incorporate most of my test papers for the printouts from IDEA in a Word document, and I use a screen printer this one allows you to edit as well, so you can cut and paste that right into the Word document and then do whatever writing you want right in the document. This process, for me at least, is an ever-changing process. So I'm trying to keep up with what the software companies are doing and try to continually expand and improve what we're doing so that we can do a better job with testing and cover much more ground in the same or less amount of time. So the software companies here that we're working with are we have a claims auditor who has to approve all claims, all invoices before they can be paid. So they're working on doing that right in the system. So I'm hoping to adapt similar tests for the claims audit function as the purchasing agent right into our analytic tests, and using the same interview and audit trail tests and things like that. And I'm also looking to work with the audit trails that we have so I can trace back, do a better job of tracing back to see the timing of the requisition approvals and see how long they were before the issuance of the PO, or was that really a big rush. This year we're also working on comparing IT log files to employee files, looking for ghost employees or perhaps indications where non-employees have access to the system and why they would, or if IT isn't being notified in a timely manner that employees are no longer employed. We're working on various types of adjusting entry testing using Benfords law and word analysis to see if there's any kind of keyword patterns, and also looking at employees at key positions that have very low withholdings to see if there's a risk that if they're living beyond, if that was an indication that they're living beyond their means and they're in a key area, we might want to assign a higher risk to that area while we're doing our test considerations. A couple quick helpful hints. If you're going to keep doing the test over and over, it's really worth it to try to learn how to automate the test. That's easier said than done, but if you can learn how to script and how to do that, or ask the automation people to help you with that, I think it would be a great thing. Develop standard import templates. That way you're always getting things in the same format. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to run a test and your date fields are not dates, they turn up being characters, and you're trying to do a test on them and it just doesn't work, or compare them to join it to another file and the files just won't join because you've got all these field errors in them. And as you're developing the test, just test and retest and see what can go wrong, and do it on as often as you can, and really pay attention to being critical of what the results are. There's nothing worse than having a false result and then relying on it and showing it to somebody and saying, oh, that didn't work. And if you're doing automation, try to build file names into it so that you're standardized. And like I said, revise on a regular basis. These were some of the things that I found helpful in inspiring my approach. Well, first was Mark Negrini's book on forensic analytics. That helped me come up with those incremental stratifications. He called them histograms, but I learned quite a bit from reading that book, and a lot about Benford's law. The webinars from AuditNet and Fraud Resources Net. One particularly good one that I liked was on transactional scoring, and that's available through Audit Software videos. And I can't give enough plugs to the automation help desk. Without them, I couldn't do half of what I've done. I don't know how they put up with me over the years.